a sacred treasure is carried out of a burning temple, lifted from the smoke of Jerusalem, and turned into a trophy for kings. But from that moment on, every empire that claims it begins to face its own shadow. Rome displays it in triumph. Later conquerors may seize it. Kingdoms rise around it, then collapse into silence. Was it truly a curse, or simply the danger of stealing what was never meant to belong to power? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of ancient mystery and lost history you enjoy. The flames rise over Jerusalem before the sun has fully climbed above the eastern hills, turning the white stone of the temple into something unreal, something almost molten, as if the mountain itself has opened and begun to burn from within. Smoke rolls upward in heavy black columns thick with cedar ash oil dust, and the bitter scent of a city that has reached the edge of its own memory. Below the walls, Roman soldiers move through broken gates and shattered courtyards, their armour dulled by soot, their sandals slipping over rubble and blood-darkened stone. Somewhere inside the sacred precinct, where generations have carried offerings, whispered prayers, and guarded the belief that heaven touches earth, in one chosen place gold flashes in the firelight. It is not ordinary gold, at least not to those who've protected it, feared for it, and imagined it as part of the living order of the world. The objects inside the temple are not simply valuables waiting to be weighed and melted. They are vessels of identity, memory, lore, and loss. A lampstand of beaten gold, sacred tables, silver trumpets, basins, bowls, curtains, and ornaments have stood within a space most people are never allowed to enter. What survives in the record suggests that even the Romans, who are used to stripping conquered cities of their wealth, understand that this prize carries a force beyond its metal. They have taken treasures before from Greek temples, Egyptian palaces, and defeated kings across the Mediterranean. But this treasure is different because the people who lose it do not see it as royal property. They see it as something bound to God, covenant, and survival itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of this treasure is not only a story of gold carried out of a burning sanctuary, it becomes a trail through emperors, conquerors, vanished kingdoms, and legends that refuse to die. It begins in fire, but it does not end there. In the year 70, CE Jerusalem is not falling in a single clean moment. It has been dying by degrees. Hunger has worked its way through the streets long before the final assault. Families have hidden in courtyard cisterns and cramped houses, listening to the dull percussion of Roman siege engines striking stone. The city, crowded with refugees and divided by factions, has endured months of terror. The Roman army under Titus has advanced with the practical patience of a machine, building earthworks, cutting off escape, reducing defences one wall at a time. Scholars still debate details in the surviving accounts, especially because the most important narrative comes from Josephus, a Jewish commander turned Roman-sponsored historian whose perspective is both invaluable and complicated. Yet the broad outline remains clear. Jerusalem is surrounded, starved, breached, and finally consumed. The temple stands at the centre of this catastrophe. It is not merely an important building. It is the heart around which the city's sacred geography turns. From a distance, ancient writers describe it as dazzling, its stone and gold catching the light so fiercely that it can blind the eye. The evidence remains incomplete, and some descriptions are shaped by awe or memory, but archaeology and texts together suggest a vast complex of courts, gates, porticos, and retaining walls built on a scale meant to impress both worshippers and rulers. Herod the Great had expanded it with imperial ambition and local religious meaning fused into one monumental project. By the time Roman soldiers enter its inner courts, the temple has become a symbol too large to belong only to the priests who serve it. It is the visible centre of a people's past and the fragile promise of their future. That is why the treasure matters before it is ever taken. Gold becomes dangerous when it gathers meanings that armies cannot understand but kings cannot resist. The Romans see victory payment and spectacle. The defenders see desecration, exile, and the tearing of a sacred order. Later generations will see something else again, a mystery. They will ask where the vessels went who possessed them, whether they brought blessing doom, or merely the heavy burden of stolen holiness. No single explanation fully accounts for the power this story gains over time, because the treasure is never only material. It moves from object into symbol, and symbols are harder to bury than gold. The final hours inside the temple are difficult to reconstruct. Josephus claims Titus does not intend to destroy the sanctuary, or at least not at first, but this has long been debated. Roman commanders could be pragmatic about sacred places when preservation served politics, but they could also erase them when destruction made a stronger point. In the chaos of siege warfare, command and accident blur. A torch thrown through a golden window, soldiers enraged by resistance, commanders losing control, defenders trapped in fire and smoke. The ancient narrative gives drama, but history remains cautious. What can be said with confidence is that the temple burns, and once it burns, the world that gathered around it cannot be restored in the same form. Imagine the interior heat. Gold does not vanish easily, but it gleams, softens, and reflects flame with the terrible brightness. Wooden beams crack overhead. Stone blocks burst from sudden changes in temperature. Curtains catch fire. Sacred utensils, perhaps hidden, perhaps seized, perhaps carried away, in organized looting, pass from priestly custody into military hands. The men who take them may not know every ritual meaning attached to each object. Some may only know that precious metal belongs to the conqueror. Others may understand that these are trophies unlike coins or jewelry. In Rome, a conquered people must be made visible. Their defeat must be translated into something the crowd can see. The temple treasure will become that visible proof. This is one of the stranger details of the empire. It is never enough for power to win. Power must display the evidence of winning. Rome has perfected the language of triumph. Captive kings, exotic animals, painted scenes of battle wagons loaded with treasure, and prisoners in chains are all arranged into a moving theatre of domination. The fall of Jerusalem will be staged in exactly this way. What is dragged from the smoke of the temple will cross the sea, enter the capital of the conquerors, and be carried before spectators who may know little of Judea, but understand gold submission and spectacle very well. Yet the more Rome displays the treasure, the more it preserves the memory of what it has destroyed. That is the irony at the centre of the curse. A stolen sacred object can proclaim victory, but it also keeps alive the wound of the defeated. It forces the conqueror to carry the story of the conquered into its own monuments. In trying to make Jerusalem's treasure Roman Rome, ensures that Jerusalem's loss will be carved into Roman stone. For now, though, the treasure is still inside the smoke. The city still burns around it. The courtyards that once held pilgrims are filled with soldiers. The sound of prayer has been replaced by collapsing roofs, shouted orders, and the crackle of flame. No one standing there can see the long path ahead through imperial vaults, triumphal arches, barbarian invasions, vanished kingdoms, and centuries of speculation. No one can know that these objects or the idea of them will outlive the men who seize them. But in that burning hour a pattern begins. Kings and emperors will reach for sacred wealth as if possession can make victory permanent. Again and again the treasure will pass into stronger hands, and again those hands will fail to hold the world together. Long before Roman hands close around the sacred vessels, the treasure of the temple has already passed through centuries of longing, rebuilding loss and return. Its power does not come from gold alone. Gold is only the surface the Parthian Empire can weigh, record parade, and lock away. Beneath it lies something far more difficult to seize the memory of a people who've learned again and again that a sanctuary can be destroyed, a kingdom can be broken, and yet the idea of holiness can survive in fragments. By the time Jerusalem burns in 70 SC, the temple treasure carries the weight of older disasters. It is not the first sacred wealth to be endangered, and for many watching the smoke rise over the city, it must feel like history has folded back on itself. The first great temple, remembered as Solomon's Temple, had stood as the centre of ancient Judah's sacred world until the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. What exactly that first sanctuary contained, how it looked, and how closely later memory preserved its form remains subjects of careful debate, because the evidence is a mixture of biblical tradition, archaeology, and later interpretation. But the broad historical wound is unmistakable. Jerusalem fell, the elite were deported, the temple was ruined, sacred objects were carried away by a conquering empire. For later generations, this earlier catastrophe became more than political defeat. It became a warning that sacred wealth could be lost when the world was violently reordered by kings. When exiles returned and a second temple rose in Jerusalem, the rebuilt sanctuary was humbler at first, but its meaning deepened with time. It stood not merely as a replacement building, but as a declaration that the relationship between people, land law, and God had not been erased. Offerings resumed, priests served, pilgrims came up to Jerusalem, sacred vessels were made restored, donated and guarded. The treasure slowly accumulated not only in storerooms and courts, but in imagination. Each lamp table, basin, cup and curtain helped hold together a fragile order in which ritual made the invisible visible. The evidence remains incomplete for many details of daily temple administration, but what survives in the record suggests a complex institution, wealthy enough to attract attention, disciplined enough to function across generations, and sacred enough to inspire fierce devotion. The temple's wealth came from many streams. There were offerings from worshippers, donations from rulers, taxes sent by Jewish communities across the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, and gifts given in moments of gratitude, obligation, or political calculation. Coins arrived from far beyond Judea, carried by pilgrims who might never again stand within sight of the sanctuary. The temple was in one sense a religious centre, but it was also an economic force. It stored valuables, supported priests and workers, purchased animals, maintained architecture, and anchored the rhythm of festivals that filled Jerusalem with crowds. This combination made it powerful, and power always attracts watchers. Yet to describe the temple treasury only as an ancient bank would miss the heart of the matter. Its wealth was not neutral. It was sanctified by use and intention. A golden vessel used in ritual did not mean the same thing as a golden cup on a nobleman's table. A lampstand inside the sanctuary was not merely lighting equipment. It represented order, presence, and continuity. The table, the vessels, the curtains, the incense implements, and the hidden spaces of the sacred precinct formed a world of symbols that ordinary people may never fully see, but nevertheless understood as essential. What mattered was not public access. What mattered was trust, that the rites continued, that the priest entered where others could not, and that the sacred centre still held. This is why treasure can become more dangerous when it belongs to a god than when it belongs to a king. Royal treasure may legitimize a dynasty, pay soldiers, reward allies, and impress enemies. Sacred treasure does something subtler. It binds political life to cosmic order. It says that a community is not merely surviving by force, but standing within a pattern sanctioned by heaven. For Judea, a land repeatedly pressed between larger powers, that symbolism mattered intensely. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Ptolemies, Seleucids, Hasmoneans, Herodians, and Romans had all shaped the region's fate in different ways. Through these shifting overlords, the temple remained the place where identity could gather when kings failed or foreign governors ruled. The most famous of the temple objects, at least in later memory, is the golden menorah. Its image is now so strongly associated with the Roman triumph that it is difficult to imagine it before capture, before stone relief, before loss. But in its own sacred setting, the lampstand belonged to a ritual world older than Rome's victory. The exact appearance of the temple menorah before its depiction on the Arch of Titus is still discussed by scholars, partly because artistic representations can simplify or alter sacred objects for public display. Even so, the image of a many-branched lampstand of gold becomes the clearest surviving visual clue to the treasure's passage from Jerusalem to Rome. It is the object that makes the vanished treasure almost visible. There were other treasures too, less famous but no less meaningful. Sacred tables connected to offerings, vessels for libations and incense, trumpets used by priests, rich curtains separating sacred spaces, gold and silver ornaments donated over generations. Some objects may have been hidden before the final Roman breach, others may have been destroyed, melted, or seized. No single account allows a complete inventory, and later traditions sometimes magnify what was lost into almost unimaginable wealth. But the uncertainty itself reveals something important. A treasure does not need to be fully catalogued to become legendary. Sometimes mystery begins exactly where the records fail. The temple also held another kind of wealth-disciplined time. Morning and evening rites, festivals, sacrifices, purification rituals, songs and processions gave shape to the year. Pilgrims arriving for major festivals entered a city transformed by movement, animals, noise, smoke, and expectation. They came from villages in Judea, from Galilee, from diaspora communities scattered across the Roman world, bringing coins, stories, accents, and hopes. The stones of Jerusalem absorbed these crossings. The sacred treasure stood at the center of all of it, not as decoration but as proof that the ancient pattern continued. That's what Rome eventually takes, not only gold but the visible instruments of continuity. When the soldiers lift the vessels from the ruined sanctuary, they remove objects that have helped generations imagine stability in an unstable world. The Romans may see plunder. The survivors see a severed connection. Later kings will see prestige in possessing what Rome once captured. But already before the treasure begins its long journey through empire and legend, it has become something no conqueror can fully control. The more sacred an object is, the less it belongs to whoever holds it by force. It carries memory with it. It carries accusation. And in the hands of kings that can feel very much like a curse. By the time Rome begins to look closely at Judea, it is already an empire trained to notice wealth wherever wealth gathers. Its appetite is not always crude. Rome can be patient, legalistic, even respectful when respect serves control. It can leave local elites in place, confirm priestly privileges, honor old customs, and speak the language of order. But beneath that surface lies a hard imperial instinct. Every province must be made useful. Every frontier must be secured. Every local crisis must be prevented from spreading into something that threatens Roman authority. Judea is small compared with Egypt, Syria, or Asia Minor, but it sits in a dangerous landscape of roads, deserts, ports, pilgrimage routes, and religious intensity. It is close enough to powerful eastern frontiers to matter, and restless enough to worry governors who prefer taxes to rebellions. Rome does not arrive in Judea as a sudden storm. It enters through politics before it rules through soldiers. In the 1st century BCE, Roman power spreads across the eastern Mediterranean after generations of wars with Hellenistic kingdoms. Local dynasties learn that survival often depends on choosing the right patron at the right moment. Judea's Hasmonean kingdom, born from revolt against Seleucid rule, has already mixed priesthood-kingship conquest and internal rivalry into a volatile political inheritance. When Roman generals and diplomats step into these disputes, they do what Rome often does best: they turn local division into imperial leverage. Pompey enters Jerusalem in 63 BCE, and from that moment Judea's independence becomes conditional, negotiated under the shadow of Roman power. The temple survives that earlier Roman intrusion, but the memory of foreign soldiers entering sacred space leaves a mark. Pompey, according to later accounts, enters the innermost sanctuary and finds no image of a god there, a detail that fascinates Roman observers because it violates their expectations of what a temple should contain. He does not strip the sanctuary in that moment, or at least the tradition insists that he leaves the treasure largely untouched. Scholars still debate how much of this account reflects exact memory, and how much has been shaped by later moral contrast. Yet its significance is clear. Rome has learned that Jerusalem's sacred centre is unlike ordinary temples of the Mediterranean. It is wealthy, politically sensitive, and charged with meanings that outsiders can easily underestimate. In the decades that follow, Judea becomes a land ruled through compromise and pressure. Herod the Great, backed by Rome, builds on a scale that is almost theatrical. He expands the Temple Mount into one of the grandest sacred complexes in the ancient world, using architecture to bind his disputed kingship to Jewish tradition, while also demonstrating the kind of monumental ambition Rome admires. The result is both magnificent and uneasy. A client king with Roman support enlarges the sanctuary of a people whose deepest loyalties cannot be reduced to imperial favour. Herod's temple glitters, but beneath its stones lies tension. The same project that honours sacred identity also ties that identity to a political order many resent. After Herod's death, the balance grows more fragile. His kingdom is divided among heirs, then portions of it fall under direct Roman administration. Governors, prefects, and procurators must manage taxes, legal disputes, priestly appointments, public order, and the unpredictable power of religious festivals. Jerusalem during pilgrimage seasons is not just crowded, it is combustible. Tens of thousands, perhaps more, gather in a city where memory, prophecy, resentment, and hope are packed into narrow streets. Roman troops are stationed where they can watch the temple courts. Their presence is practical from an administrative point of view, but from the perspective of worshippers, it is also a constant reminder that sacred life continues under foreign surveillance. The temple treasury in this atmosphere becomes more than a storehouse. It becomes a tempting solution to Roman problems and a symbol of Roman intrusion. Several episodes before the Great Revolt show how dangerous this can be. Roman officials sometimes need money for public works, military expenses, or imperial obligations. The temple contains wealth that seems available to those with power, but sacred to those who donated it. When a governor or ruler touches that wealth, even for a project that might be defended as civic improvement, the act can feel like violation. The evidence remains incomplete for some incidents, and ancient sources are often hostile to particular officials, but the pattern is unmistakable. Attempts to exploit sacred funds deepen mistrust and turn economic pressure into religious outrage. This is where the treasure begins its transformation into an imperial target. Not because Rome initially sets out with a single plan to steal the temple vessels, but because the machinery of empire keeps pushing sacred and political worlds into collision. Rome expects obedience, revenue, and public calm. Judeans expect the temple to remain protected from profane interference. Local elites try to mediate, sometimes sincerely and sometimes for their own advantage. Priestly families depend on Roman favour, yet must retain legitimacy among their own people. Governors often misunderstand the emotional charge of their decisions. Rebels and prophets interpret compromise as betrayal. In this crowded space of competing loyalties, gold becomes a pressure point. The wider empire is also changing. Rome in the 1st century CE is wealthy, but wealth does not make it calm. Emperors rise and fall. Armies make and unmake rulers. Provinces are not merely distant possessions. They are sources of grain tax soldiers, prestige and danger. Judea's unrest eventually becomes impossible to treat as a local disturbance. When revolt breaks out in 66 CE, it is fueled by many causes: misgovernment, social division, religious offence, economic strain, militant expectation, and the brutal logic of escalation. No single explanation fully accounts for this revolt, because revolts are rarely born from one wound. They grow when many wounds begin to speak the same language. For Rome, rebellion changes the meaning of the temple. As long as Jerusalem submits, the sanctuary may be tolerated, managed, and watched. Once revolt hardens, the temple becomes the symbolic fortress of resistance, whether every priest or worshipper desires that role or not. Its courts, walls, and treasury are folded into the military and political imagination of the war. To defeat Jerusalem without mastering the temple would be an incomplete victory. To leave its sacred wealth untouched after such defiance might look like restraint, but it might also look like weakness. Roman power depends on making examples, and Jerusalem is becoming an example. The tragedy is that the treasure's sacredness protects it in one world and endangers it in another. Within Judean religious life, its holiness sets it apart. Within Roman imperial logic, that same holiness makes it valuable as a trophy. The more deeply a people reveres an object, the more useful that object becomes to a conqueror who wants their defeat to be seen and remembered. By the time Titus marches toward Jerusalem, the sacred vessels are already caught between meanings. They are instruments of worship to the people who guard them, wealth to soldiers who will claim them, and future propaganda to an empire that understands the power of spectacle. So Rome's eyes settle on Jerusalem not simply because gold lies there, but because authority lies there. The prize is not only metal hidden behind walls, it is the right to say that Rome has broken the centre of resistance, entered the place thought untouchable, and carried away what generations believed could not belong to any earthly king. That is the chain of decisions, misunderstandings, ambitions, and fears that leads toward the fire. Before the treasure is taken, it is slowly made vulnerable by the very forces that make it sacred. Jerusalem does not fall like a gate swinging open. It gives way like a body that has endured too much and can no longer hide the damage. By the summer of 70 CE, the city has been pressed from the outside by Roman engineering and torn from the inside by hunger, fear, and factional violence. The defenders still hold towers, walls, courtyards, and sacred ground, but the rhythm of the siege has changed. Rome has time, timber discipline, and a commander who understands that stone can be defeated by patience as much as by force. The people inside have memory, conviction, desperation, and nowhere left to retreat. Between those two worlds lies a city slowly being emptied of ordinary life. The Roman army surrounding Jerusalem is not an uncontrolled mob. It is a machine made of camps, ditches, watchposts, siege towers, battering rams, and men train to turn landscapes into weapons. Trees around the city are cut down for works of war until the hills themselves begin to look stripped and wounded. This detail, preserved in ancient accounts, is one of the quieter horrors of the siege. A city can be destroyed from within its walls, but the country around it is also transformed. Olive groves, gardens, and familiar slopes vanish into military construction. The siege does not simply threaten Jerusalem's buildings. It erases the living border between city and land. Inside the walls, hunger becomes a second army. It moves silently through houses before the Romans reach them. Grain disappears. Prices lose meaning. Families hide scraps. The wealthy and the poor suffer differently at first, but starvation is patient, and over time it narrows the distance between them. Ancient descriptions of famine often become extreme, shaped by moral warning and literary horror, so scholars still debate how much detail can be taken literally in the surviving accounts. Yet the reality beneath them is not doubtful. A besieged city cut off from food becomes a place where social rules fray. Trust shrinks, bodies weaken. The sacred calendar continues to hang over the city, but ordinary time is replaced by the counting of meals that no longer exist. The temple remains both refuge and target. Its courts are not peaceful sanctuaries in these final days. They are crowded with fighters, civilians, priests, and those who have fled upward toward the holiest place, because there is nowhere else that still feels protected. What survives in the record suggests that factions within the city had already turned parts of Jerusalem into battlegrounds before the Romans completed their work. This internal violence does not make the Roman assault less devastating, but it helps explain why the end comes with such confusion. Jerusalem is not only conquered from without, it is exhausted from within. Titus, son of the new Emperor Vespasian, leads the Roman campaign at a moment when his family needs victory to shine brightly. The empire has recently passed through civil war, the so-called Year of the Four Emperors, when Roman legitimacy was decided not by calm inheritance but by armies and speed. Vespasian's rise from general to emperor must be justified in the eyes of Rome, and Judea offers a stage on which military success can be converted into political authority. That does not mean every Roman decision at Jerusalem is propaganda from the beginning. Battles are messy, commanders improvise, soldiers disobey, but the war's meaning is already larger than the city. The fall of Jerusalem will help stabilize a dynasty. As the Romans breach the outer defenses and push closer to the temple, the fighting becomes compressed into sacred architecture. Walls, gates, colonnades, steps, and courts become tactical positions. Places designed for procession and worship are repurposed for survival and killing. This is one of the deepest violences of the moment the temple is not only destroyed as a building, but forced to become something opposite to itself before it burns. Every stone that once organized ritual movement now shapes combat. Every gate becomes a point of entry or refusal. The sacred center is dragged into the grammar of siege warfare. The fire itself remains one of the great contested images of the ancient world. Josephus presents Titus as reluctant to destroy the temple, insisting that the flames begin through the fury of soldiers during the assault. Many historians treat this claim cautiously. Josephus wrote under Flavian patronage, and portraying Titus as merciful may have served Roman political memory. On the other hand, ancient battles often did escape command, especially once troops were enraged by resistance and tempted by plunder. No single explanation fully accounts for the burning. It may have involved accident rage, tactical necessity, deliberate policy, or some mixture of all four. What matters is that once the flames take hold, intention becomes almost irrelevant to the people who watch their world vanish. The image is terrible because it is both vast and intimate. The outer courts fill with smoke. Roof beams catch. Gold reflects the flames so fiercely that the fire seems to multiply. Men rush toward treasure and are driven back by heat. Others fight through smoke not for glory but because panic has narrowed the world to a few steps ahead. The cries of the wounded mix with the crash of falling timber and stone. Sacred objects that had been touched only through ritual are now exposed to hands blackened with soot. Whether some vessels are seized before the worst of the fire, whether others are hidden or damaged, whether priests attempt to protect them in the final confusion, the evidence remains incomplete. But by the end, Rome has what it needs, the sanctuary is broken and its wealth can be claimed. The destruction does not stop at the temple. Jerusalem itself is crushed with the kind of thoroughness Rome reserves for places that must not become symbols of easy rebellion. Buildings are burned or demolished. Survivors are killed, enslaved or scattered. Some are saved for spectacle. Others vanish into the slave markets of the empire. A city known through pilgrimage becomes known through absence. The temple platform remains, but the ritual life that once gave it meaning is severed. In later centuries, stones will still stand and memory will gather around them. But in 70 CE, what remains is smoke silence and the stunned knowledge that the impossible has happened again. For the Roman soldiers, the treasure is reward. For Titus, it is proof. For Vespasian's new dynasty, it is political capital. For the survivors, it is a wound carried beyond geography. The sacred vessels now begin their second life, not in the hidden spaces of Jerusalem, but in the public imagination of Rome. They will be cleaned, guarded, catalogued, displayed, and made to speak a language their makers never intended. Yet the fire changes them before the triumph does. They are no longer only instruments of worship. They are relics of catastrophe. And from that moment forward, every ruler who touches them touches not only gold, but the memory of a city burned around it. The treasure leaves Jerusalem not as treasure alone, but as evidence. It has to travel because Rome's victory has to travel. A burned sanctuary in Judea is a military fact, but an empire does not live on facts alone. It lives on scenes, symbols, and public memory. The people in Rome have not heard the stones crack in the heat, have not smelled the smoke of cedar beams, and scorched offerings, have not watched the last defenders vanish into flame. For them the war must be translated into something visible, something ordered, something that can pass through the streets and tell a simple story. Rome fought, Rome conquered Rome, brought the sacred wealth of Jerusalem home. The journey itself is mostly hidden from us. The surviving sources do not give a neat itinerary for each object, each guard, each ship, each pause along the road. What survives in the record suggests that the most important vessels are preserved carefully enough to be displayed later, which means they are not treated as random plunder to be immediately melted down. They are selected, protected, and carried through the imperial system like trophies already awaiting their stage. Other valuables may be divided, sold, stored, or lost in the confusion after conquest. Soldiers expect reward. Commanders expect glory. The state expects profit. But the most symbolically powerful objects are held apart because their meaning is too useful to waste. From Jerusalem, the treasure likely moves first through the hands of officials and officers who understand its political value. It may pass through Caesarea Maritima, the great Roman port on the coast where Judea opens onto the Mediterranean. That city built and enlarged under Herod is almost the opposite of Jerusalem in spirit, a harbour of imperial stone ships, warehouses, administrative offices, and sea wind facing west toward Rome. These sacred vessels that had belonged to a mountain sanctuary now begin a maritime passage across the world of Roman power. The contrast is stark. In Jerusalem they stood within rituals shaped by law and holiness. On the coast they become cargo guarded by soldiers. At sea they become imperial property moving through the same routes that carry grain, marble, slaves, letters and taxes. There is a lesser-known detail that reveals how Rome turns catastrophe into finance. The spoils from the Jewish war help fund the Flavian dynasty's public building program, most famously the great amphitheatre later known as the Colosseum. The exact accounting remains debated, and not every coin or stone can be traced cleanly to Judean plunder, but Roman inscriptions and historical context support the broader connection between conquered wealth and monumental display. This matters because the treasure is not only shown, it is converted into architecture, entertainment, and imperial legitimacy. The wealth of a destroyed sanctuary helps pay for spaces where Rome celebrates itself. Sacred loss becomes public stone. When Vespasian and Titus stage their triumph in Rome, the war is transformed into theatre. A Roman triumph is not a casual parade. It is a ritual of victory, power, and hierarchy with deep roots in republican tradition and imperial reinvention. The general, the army, the captives, the spoils, the painted scenes, the exotic symbols of conquered lands all move through the city in a carefully arranged spectacle. It is history made into procession. The crowd does not need to understand every political cause of the Judean revolt or every faction inside Jerusalem. They are given images instead. Captives show defeat. Treasure shows victory. Sacred objects show that even the gods, or what Rome understands as the gods of the defeated, have been overcome. For the people watching from the streets, the temple vessels must have seemed strange and splendid. The golden lampstand, heavy and branching unlike ordinary Roman sacred furniture, catches the eye. The table and other vessels suggest a ritual world foreign to many spectators. Painted panels may show battles, burning buildings, rivers, landscapes, and defeated cities. Rome has always been curious about the exotic, especially when the exotic arrives in chains. The triumph turns Judea into a story the crowd can consume. It compresses years of tension, famine, siege, and grief into a moving pageant of domination. The evidence remains incomplete for exactly how every object appeared, but later reliefs and descriptions make one thing clear: the temple treasure was important enough to become central to the memory of the victory. This transformation is brutal in its simplicity. Objects once hidden from ordinary eyes are now displayed to strangers. Sacred vessels once handled according to ritual law are now carried by men performing imperial ceremony. Their meaning is inverted. In Jerusalem they had helped mark the boundary between holy and ordinary, pure and impure, permitted and forbidden. In Rome they mark the boundary between ruler and subject, conqueror, and conquered victor and captive. The same gold shines, but it speaks a different language, and yet the old meaning is not erased. That is the strange failure built into every act of sacred plunder. Rome can change the setting but not fully control the memory attached to the objects. The lampstand displayed in triumph remains recognizably the lampstand from Jerusalem. Its power as a Roman trophy depends precisely on the fact that it once belonged elsewhere. If the crowd sees only gold, the political message is smaller. If they understand that this is holy gold taken from the heart of a defeated people, the message becomes stronger. Rome needs the treasure's sacred identity in order to humiliate it. So the empire preserves what it tries to master. The captives walking near the treasure complete the scene. Some are rebel leaders, some prisoners chosen for spectacle, some perhaps survivors whose individual names are lost. Ancient triumphs often ended in execution for prominent enemies, while others were sold into slavery or kept for display. The war's human cost is therefore bound to the objects. Gold and bodies moved together through the city. Rome does not merely show what it has taken, it shows whom it has broken. What survives in the record suggests that the triumph of Vespasian and Titus was one of the defining public events of the new dynasty, a way of telling Rome that order had returned after civil war, and that the Flavian house had been chosen by victory. For Vespasian, the treasure helps solve a problem that all new rulers face: how to make power look inevitable after it has been seized. He's not born into the old Julio-Claudian line. He rises from military command and political crisis. Victory in Judea allows him to present himself as restorer, conqueror, and stabilizer. Titus, his son, shares in that glory. The captured vessels become props in a larger drama of succession. They help turn a provincial war into a dynastic foundation myth. This is not unusual in Roman history, but the nature of the treasure makes it especially charged. A dynasty seeking legitimacy builds its image partly on the display of sacred spoils. The treasure is eventually placed in Rome associated with the Temple of Peace, a complex built under Vespasian, that functions as both monument and museum of imperial power. The name itself is almost painfully ironic. Peace in this case is what Rome calls the silence after conquest. Within such a setting, the vessels from Jerusalem are no longer active instruments of worship. They become curated evidence of victory admired as art wealth and proof of order restored. Scholars still debate details about how long particular objects remained there and what later inventories truly describe, but the symbolic shift is unmistakable. The sacred center of one people becomes an ornament in the capital of another. This is the moment when the treasure's curse, if we use that word carefully, begins to take shape. Not as a spell hidden in gold, not as a supernatural revenge waiting in the metal. The curse is a human pattern. A ruler takes something holy from a defeated people and believes possession equals mastery. He mistakes display for permanence. He assumes that what can be carried through the streets can be made obedient to imperial meaning. But the treasure carries another story inside it, a story of burning exile and loss. Rome has captured the vessels, but it has also invited their memory into the heart of the empire. From this point on, the treasure will no longer belong peacefully to anyone. Stone remembers what gold cannot. Gold can be melted, stolen, hidden, broken into coin, carried across seas, or swallowed by the silence of vaults and ruins. Stone is slower. It can be damaged, reinterpreted, half-buried, cleaned, restored, misunderstood, and still remain in place long enough to outlive the hands that carved it. In Rome, near the old heart of imperial power, the Arch of Titus still stands as the most visible witness to the temple treasure's second life. It does not give us the treasure itself. It gives us something almost as powerful, the image Rome wanted the world to remember. The arch rises on the ancient route of triumph, where victorious processions once moved through the city toward the Capitoline Hill. To pass beneath it is to step into a narrow chamber of imperial memory. On one side, carved figures carry the spoils of Jerusalem. The most famous object is unmistakable, the great seven-branched lampstand lifted on poles by Roman bearers, its branches curving outward in heavy symmetry. Nearby are other sacred objects, including a table and trumpets, rendered not as abstract symbols, but as physical trophies being transported through public space. The relief is not a photograph, and scholars still debate how faithfully it records the actual appearance of the vessels, but it is the closest surviving visual testimony to the treasure taken from the temple. The scene is both documentary and propaganda. It shows an event that happened, but it shows it through the eyes of power. Roman artists do not carve the grief of Jerusalem. They do not show the famine, the shattered courtyards, the burned beams, or the people searching for the dead. They show order. They show bearers moving in disciplined procession. They show sacred wealth, absorbed into the calm rhythm of Roman victory. The chaos of conquest has been smoothed into marble. This is how empires prefer to remember violence not as terror, but as ceremony. Yet the relief betrays more than it intends. The treasure appears too distinctive to become merely Roman. The lampstand especially refuses to disappear into generic plunder. Its shape marks it as belonging to another sacred world, and that foreignness is the entire point. Rome displays the difference it has conquered. The bearers carry the objects forward, but the viewer's eye moves backward toward the sanctuary that no longer exists. In this way, the arch becomes a strange memorial to the very loss it celebrates. It is built to honor Titus and his dynasty, but it also preserves the wound of Jerusalem with a clarity no Roman official could fully control. The arch itself was completed after Titus's death under his brother Domitian, and this matters. It is not only a monument to victory, it is a monument to dynasty. Titus is shown as a victorious commander, almost lifted into divine memory, while the conquest of Judea is folded into the legitimacy of the Flavian house. Vespasian had used the war to strengthen his claim after civil disorder. Titus had inherited that glory. Domitian, ruling after both father and brother, inherits the need to keep that glory visible. The temple treasure therefore continues to serve rulers even after its first display. It becomes carved proof that this family brought victory, wealth, and order to Rome. But stone evidence has limits. The arch shows that the sacred vessels were carried in triumph. It does not tell us where every object was stored afterward, how often they were displayed, who guarded them, or what happened to them across the following centuries. The evidence remains incomplete, and this incompleteness is precisely where legend begins to gather. The relief fixes one moment with extraordinary force, then leaves the next moments open. We can see the treasure moving through Rome, but we cannot follow it with equal confidence into every vault, temple, sack ship, or royal hoard that later stories imagine. The Temple of Peace is the next likely setting, a vast complex built by Vespasian, where spoils and artworks could be displayed as part of imperial grandeur. The name suggests serenity, but its collections were born from conquest. In such a place, the vessels from Jerusalem would have stood among treasures from many lands made into objects of admiration and political meaning. Visitors could gaze upon them not as instruments of living worship, but as trophies arranged under the authority of Rome. What survives in the record suggests they remained famous enough for later writers to mention, though those references are scattered, sometimes ambiguous, and difficult to connect into a continuous chain. A lesser-known part of the story is how the arch's meaning changes over time. For centuries, Jewish tradition treated the monument not merely as ancient Roman art, but as an image of catastrophe. Some later Jewish visitors reportedly avoided walking beneath it, turning the Roman path of triumph into a path of mourning. Whether every detail of that custom can be traced securely through the centuries is uncertain, but the emotional logic is clear. A monument built to celebrate defeat can become for the defeated and their descendants a place where memory resists humiliation. The stone remains Roman, but the meaning is no longer Rome's alone. The arch also complicates the idea of the curse. If the treasure had simply vanished at once, it might have become a tale of disappearance only. But because Rome carved it, the empire made itself permanently responsible for the memory of theft. Every later generation that looks at the relief sees not just Roman victory, but sacred plunder. The monument continues to ask uncomfortable questions without speaking them aloud. What does conquest really preserve? What does it destroy? Can an empire own the holiness of another people by carrying away its instruments? The arch cannot answer, but it keeps the questions in view. There is also a quiet irony in the survival of the monument. The Flavian dynasty does not last forever. Rome's political order shifts, fractures, Christianizes, divides, and changes beyond recognition. Temples close. Gods lose public sacrifices. Palaces decay. Forums fill with debris. Medieval buildings press against ancient ruins. The empire that displayed the treasure as proof of permanence proves temporary like every power before it. Yet the carved menorah remains visible. The object it depicts may be lost, but its image survives the empire that took it. That survival gives the arch its haunting force. It stands between history and absence. It confirms that the treasure was real enough to be paraded and carved, but not recoverable enough to be traced with certainty. It gives shape to a vanished object while deepening the mystery of its fate. After the triumph, the trail begins to darken. The gold has passed from sanctuary to procession, from fire to stone, from worship to imperial display. But Rome itself is not immune to time. The city that carved victory into marble will one day hear enemies at its gates, and the treasure that once marked domination may become part of another conqueror's prize. Rome receives the treasure as if it has received proof that history itself obeys Roman hands. The sacred vessels stand beneath the authority of a city that has learned to turn conquest into architecture, ceremony, coinage, and memory. For a time, the arrangement seems complete. Jerusalem is ruined. The triumph has passed. The arch will rise. The spoils can be displayed among other wonders no longer guarded by priests who treat them as instruments of holiness, but by an empire that treats them as evidence of order restored. Yet this is where the story begins to darken, not because gold whispers doom from a locked chamber, but because sacred plunder has a way of making victory unstable in the imagination. It shines too brightly. It reminds everyone that power can enter holy places and therefore that holy places can burn. The Flavian emperors need the Judean victory. Vespasian has come to power after a year when Rome itself seemed to forget how succession was supposed to work. Nero's death had opened a wound in the imperial system, and armies in different parts of the empire had pushed forward their own candidates. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian rose and fell through a brutal sequence of loyalty, betrayal, and military calculation. When Vespasian finally secures the throne, he needs more than command. He needs a story that makes his rule appear inevitable. The defeat of Jerusalem gives him that story. It allows a new dynasty to present itself as the force that ends disorder, punishes rebellion, and returns wealth to the capital. The temple treasure becomes part of that message. It helps transform the Flavian family from successful survivors of civil war into rulers chosen by victory. Coins, monuments, public buildings, games, and triumphal imagery all work together to persuade the Roman world that the new order is secure. The treasure is not the only tool in this political project, but it is one of the most vivid. What survives in the record suggests that the spoils of the Judean war were remembered as exceptional, not merely because they were valuable, but because they came from a sanctuary whose destruction had shaken an entire people. Rome has taken many treasures. This one carries a story strong enough to strengthen a dynasty, but there is a danger in building legitimacy on destruction. A ruler who displays sacred plunder is also displaying the violence that made possession possible. For supporters, that violence looks like strength. For enemies, it can look like arrogance. For the conquered, it becomes a wound that refuses to close. The same object can hold all three meanings at once. A golden lampstand in a Roman complex may impress visitors, but it also silently remembers a city in flames. The Romans may intend it to say that rebellion fails. Others may hear that empires violate what they cannot understand. The curse begins here as a pattern of misreading. Rome believes that to possess the vessels is to master their meaning, yet sacred objects do not become empty when they are removed from their ritual setting. they become displaced, and displacement can make them even more powerful. In Jerusalem, the treasure belonged to a system of priests, offerings, courts, purity laws, festivals, and sacred time. In Rome, stripped of that system, it becomes a concentrated symbol of loss. Its very uselessness as a Roman ritual object makes it more haunting. It cannot truly function in the world that has captured it. It can only be shown. Meanwhile, the empire that claims permanence continues to reveal its own fragility. Vespasian rules with practical strength and a reputation for discipline, but he cannot defeat mortality. Titus inherits him and becomes associated in later memory with generosity, tragedy, and disaster, partly because his brief reign is marked by catastrophe. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupts and buries Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other communities beneath ash, pumice, and volcanic heat. The disaster has no historical connection to the temple treasure in any literal sense, and responsible history must not pretend otherwise. Yet in the imagination of a later ages, timing matters. An emperor celebrated for the conquest of Jerusalem rules as another ancient world is suddenly entombed. The evidence remains geological, human, and administrative, not mystical. Still, the symbolic echo is difficult to ignore. Soon after, Rome suffers a major fire and a devastating epidemic during Titus's reign. Ancient sources praise his response, though. Imperial praise is never free from politics. These disasters do not prove a curse. They prove something more ordinary and more unsettling. Even the capital of the conquerors is vulnerable to forces no army can command. Fire, disease, eruption, and succession all remind Rome that domination abroad does not guarantee safety at home. The treasure taken from Jerusalem stands somewhere inside this world of imperial confidence and imperial anxiety, a brilliant object surrounded by signs that no victory remains pure for long. When Domitian follows Titus, the Flavian story grows sharper and colder. Domitian continues the dynasty, builds, governs, commands, and presents himself with commanding authority, yet his reign ends in assassination. Ancient senatorial writers, often hostile to him, shape much of his dark reputation, so scholars still debate how much was cruelty, how much was political conflict, and how much was memory written by enemies. But the end is clear enough. The Flavian house, which had raised its legitimacy on victory display and monumental confidence, does not settle into timeless rule. It lasts only a generation. The dynasty that paraded the sacred vessels as proof of destiny disappears into the same Roman instability it had promised to overcome. This does not mean the treasure kills kings. That would make the story too simple, and history is rarely so obedient. The vessels do not need supernatural power to become dangerous. Their danger lies in what rulers imagine they can do with them. Sacred plunder allows a king or emperor to claim that even the deepest identity of a conquered people has been absorbed into his own glory. But such claims are always brittle. They require constant performance. They must be carved into stone, repeated on coins, staged in ceremonies, and defended against memory. The more sacred the spoil, the more effort is required to keep it from accusing the victor. Rome's use of the treasure also reveals a larger imperial habit. The empire collects the world and places it in the capital. Obelisks from Egypt, statues from Greece, gods from the provinces, captives from distant wars, animals from deserts and forests, marble from mountains across the Mediterranean, all are gathered to make Rome feel universal. The temple vessels enter this collection of conquered meanings. Yet unlike statues of foreign gods that can be admired as art or absorbed into Roman religious curiosity, the Jerusalem treasure resists easy translation. Its sacred system is not available for Roman adoption in the same way. It remains attached to absence, As years pass, the objects become both famous and strangely silent. People may see them, speak of them, admire their workmanship and remember the triumph, but no Roman ceremony can restore their original meaning. They are preserved yet emptied of use. They are honoured as spoils yet dishonoured by the conditions of their presence. This contradiction is the heart of the curse. The treasure gives rulers prestige, but it also binds them to an act of destruction that can never be fully softened into glory. And so the gold remains in Rome, shining under another name while the empire moves through ceremonies, deaths, fires, fevers, and political fear. The city still appears eternal. Its roads still reach outward. Its armies still command provinces. Its monuments still speak in the language of permanence. But somewhere within that vast machinery rests a treasure that carries a different lesson. Every sacred thing taken by force becomes a witness, and every king who mistakes witness for possession inherits more than wealth. The treasure does not need to move in order to travel. Once it enters Rome's imagination, it begins passing from ruler to ruler in a quieter way, not always through hands, inventories, or guarded chambers, but through the political language of possession. Each emperor inherits the world that earlier emperors have collected. He inherits temples, trophies, conquered peoples, old grievances, monuments raised by dead rivals, and sacred objects torn from places that still remember them differently. The vessels from Jerusalem become part of this burden. They may rest in a display space or a treasury, or some carefully watched imperial collection, but their meaning is never still. Every new ruler of Rome becomes, whether he thinks about it or not, the latest custodian of a stolen holiness. That is one of the strange facts of empire. Conquest often outlives the conqueror as an administrative problem. A city can be burned in one campaign, but the memory of that burning can remain alive for centuries. A shrine can be stripped in a day, but the objects removed from it continue to ask what kind of power has the right to hold them. Roman emperors are surrounded by such questions because Rome is built from other people's worlds. Egyptian obelisks stand under Italian skies. Greek statues fill Roman villas. Eastern cults find followers in Western streets. Gods travel names, change, meanings blend, and the capital becomes a museum of controlled foreignness. But the temple treasure is harder to absorb. It is not easily turned into a Roman god, a decorative masterpiece, or a harmless curiosity. It remains tied to a sanctuary Rome has destroyed. As the first century gives way to the second, Rome appears stronger than ever. Its frontiers stretch across deserts, rivers, mountains, and seas. Its emperors rule from palaces, camps, and roads that seem to make distance smaller. The empire builds counts, taxes, judges, and commemorates with extraordinary confidence. Yet this same confidence depends on a constant act of memory management. Rome must tell itself that conquest produces order, that plunder becomes civilization, that violence is justified by peace. The treasure of Jerusalem fits this story only if one looks at it from the victor's side. From another angle, it is a reminder that Rome's peace often begins with someone else's ruin. The later emperors who inherit the Flavian world do not all focus on Judea, and the treasure does not dominate Roman politics in any simple way. History would be distorted if every crisis were forced back to the sacred vessels. Emperors face military revolts, frontier pressures, plague, inflation, succession, struggles, court conspiracies, and the immense difficulty of governing too much territory with too few certainties. The evidence remains incomplete about how often the temple objects were publicly seen after their first display, or whether they were moved, stored, neglected, or shown only on special occasions. Still, their symbolic life continues because the Arch of Titus and the memory of the triumph keep them present. Even silence can preserve power when the thing being silenced is famous enough. For Jewish communities across the empire, the loss of the temple reshapes religious life in profound ways. Prayer, study, law, memory, and local community take on new importance in a world without the functioning sanctuary. This transformation is not immediate or simple, and scholars still debate the pace and complexity of post-temple Judaism, especially because the surviving evidence comes from different communities and later textual traditions. But the broad movement is clear. A people whose sacred center has been destroyed does not disappear. Instead, identity adapts. The missing temple becomes a presence through absence. The treasure in Rome, whether visible or hidden, becomes part of that absence. This makes the objects burdensome, in a way ordinary treasure is not. Gold coins can be spent, statues can be admired, crowns can be worn. But sacred vessels taken from a destroyed sanctuary are difficult to use without reopening the wound. They are too charged to be melted casually, too famous to be forgotten easily, and too foreign to become fully Roman. They sit at the edge of meaning, valuable and unusable, triumphant and accusatory. For the emperors, this may not have felt like a daily concern. Most rulers probably had more urgent anxieties than the moral gravity of old spoils. Yet empires are shaped not only by what rulers consciously fear, but by what their monuments continue to say after the original speakers are gone. Over time, Rome's religious world changes around the treasure. The old public rites continue for centuries, but new movements grow spread, and sometimes alarm authorities. Among them is Christianity, born from within the Jewish world and gradually expanding through cities of the empire. Its relationship to Rome Judaism and the destroyed temple is complex, often painful, and shaped by interpretation as much as by politics. No single explanation fully accounts for how the meaning of Jerusalem changes in Roman and Christian imagination. But as Christian communities reflect on the temple's destruction, some see it through theological arguments, while Jewish communities preserve it as catastrophe and longing. The same event becomes many memories at once. By the 4th century, the empire itself begins to transform. Constantine's conversion and the rise of imperial Christianity alter the religious landscape in ways earlier emperors could hardly have imagined. Temples that once anchored public life lose support. Bishops gain influence. Jerusalem becomes important again, not as the restored temple city of Jewish hope, but as a Christian sacred landscape marked by pilgrimage churches and imperial patronage. In this changed world, the old temple vessels become even stranger. They are not active in Jewish worship. They do not belong naturally to Christian ceremony. They are remnants of a destroyed order held by an empire whose own religious identity is shifting under its feet. The burden of sacred plunder becomes clearer when the meaning of power changes. Pagan Rome had displayed the vessels as trophies of victory. Christian Rome could not display them in quite the same simple way without facing uncomfortable questions about sacred history, inheritance, and violence. Some later traditions imagine emperors, generals, or churchmen recognizing the danger of keeping such objects in the wrong place. These stories cannot always be trusted as factual roots for the treasure, but they reveal a real anxiety. The objects are imagined as things that should not rest comfortably in imperial hands. Whether because of divine judgment, political symbolism, or the unease of stolen sanctity, later memory treats them as unstable possessions. The emperors inherit not only the treasure then, but the contradiction it represents. They claim universal rule, yet the treasure reminds them that universality is often assembled from broken local worlds. They claim peace, yet the treasure comes from fire. They claim divine favor, yet the objects belong to a people whose God has not been conquered simply because a building was destroyed. Rome can command bodies, cities, taxes, and roads. It can even command the public display of sacred things, but it cannot command what those things mean to everyone. So the curse deepens without needing thunder prophecy or supernatural revenge. It lies in the gap between possession and legitimacy. Every ruler who inherits the vessels also inherits the failure of force to settle meaning. The treasure remains a trophy, but also a question. It honors victory, but also remembers desecration. It strengthens imperial stories, but also exposes their fragility. And as Rome changes, weakens, reforms, divides and struggles to defend the world, it has gathered those dangerous symbols wait in the shadows of imperial memory, ready to become treasure for the next conqueror who believes that taking what Rome has taken will make him powerful in turn. Rome's walls had seen fear before, but in 410 CE the fear has a different texture. It is older, thinner, more exhausted. The city is still magnificent in memory, still crowded with monuments that insist on eternity, still heavy with temples, basilicas, palaces, arches, columns, and the layered debris of centuries. But the empire that once seemed to breathe through Rome no longer rests securely inside it. Power has shifted to imperial courts elsewhere. Armies are harder to pay. Frontiers bend under pressure. Generals bargain with peoples Rome once called barbarians, and those peoples have learned Roman tactics, Roman politics, Roman weakness and Roman ambition all too well. The old capital remains sacred to imperial imagination, but imagination is not a wall. When Alaric and the Visigoths come to Rome, they do not arrive as strangers from a world beyond history. That older Roman habit of calling outsiders barbarian hides a more complicated reality. The Goths have been inside the Roman world for generations, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as refugees, sometimes as federate soldiers, sometimes as victims of Roman mismanagement, and sometimes as indispensable military partners. They know the empire not as a distant legend, but as a system that has used them, feared them, recruited them, betrayed them, and depended on them. Alaric himself is not simply a raider chasing gold. He is a commander shaped by Roman war, seeking security, recognition, settlement, and reward for his people. The evidence remains incomplete for every motive and negotiation, but the broad pattern is clear. The sack of Rome grows out of failed politics as much as invasion. For years before the sack, Alaric has moved through the empire's broken machinery, demanding terms from rulers who cannot decide whether to crush him, hire him, honor him, or delay him. The Western imperial court based in Ravenna is protected by marshes and caution, but its distance from Rome carries its own symbolism. Rome, the city that once commanded the Mediterranean, now depends on decisions made elsewhere, by nervous officials shifting alliances and generals whose loyalty may last only as long as payment does. Hunger again becomes a weapon. Siege again tightens around a city, and once more treasure becomes political language. Rome in 410 is not Jerusalem in 70, and the comparison must be handled carefully. Rome is not a sacred city in the same sense as the temple-centered Jerusalem of Jewish memory, and Alaric is not Titus staging a triumph for a new dynasty. Yet echoes are hard to miss. A city that once displayed the spoils of a burned sanctuary now faces men who demand the wealth of the city itself. A capital that carved conquest into stone now learns what it means to become the object of another people's bargaining. A place that had collected the world begins to lose control over what it collected. The sack lasts only 3 days, but 3 days are enough to wound a millennium of confidence. Ancient accounts differ in tone and detail, shaped by Christian interpretation, pagan nostalgia, political anxiety, and moral explanation. Some emphasize restraint, noting that churches offered refuge and that the destruction was not total by ancient standards. Others focus on shock humiliation and the shattering of Rome's aura. Scholars still debate the scale of violence and plunder, but not the psychological force of the event. Rome had been captured before in its early history, but for those living in the late Empire, the old stories of Gallic invasion belonged almost to myth. This time, the unthinkable happens in a Christian empire under the gaze of monuments that had promised permanence. Inside the city, wealth accumulated over centuries becomes suddenly vulnerable. Aristocratic houses hold silver jewellery, textiles, statues, and heirlooms. Public buildings contain metalwork, ornaments, and objects whose histories may already be half forgotten. Churches hold sacred vessels of their own. Imperial storehouses, if not already emptied or moved, become obvious targets. The Visigoths need food treasure leverage, and the portable wealth that can sustain a migrating people and reward warriors. Gold and silver are easier to carry than marble. Sacred or historic meaning may protect some objects but not all. In moments like this, old classifications collapse. Art becomes bullion. Memory becomes loot. Ceremony becomes metal. Here the trail of the temple treasure enters shadow. Later traditions suggest that the sacred vessels taken from Jerusalem may have still been in Rome when Alaric's forces entered the city, and that the Visigoths may have carried them away with other imperial spoils. This possibility has fascinated generations because it creates a chain of reversals almost too powerful to resist Jerusalem's treasure taken by Rome, Rome's treasure taken by the Goths, sacred plunder becoming the inheritance of kings who themselves will not hold power forever. But responsible history has to slow down at this point. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive. No surviving inventory from the sack lists the menorah or the temple vessels in a way that settles the matter. What survives in the record allows possibility, not certainty. Even so, possibility matters because of the way empires store the past. If the vessels remained in Rome, whether in a palace, a treasury, a church-controlled space, or an old imperial collection, they could have been swept into the chaos of 410. If they had already been moved hidden, destroyed, melted, or transferred elsewhere, then Alaric never touched them. The problem is that late antique evidence often fails exactly where modern curiosity wants it to speak. Objects of immense symbolic importance can vanish, not in a single dramatic scene, but through transfers, fires, neglect, secrecy, or the simple silence of records that were never written or did not survive. Alaric himself does not enjoy his victory for long. Soon after the sack, as the Goths move south through Italy, he dies. His followers bury him, according to later tradition, beneath the bed of the Busento River, diverting the water, placing his body and treasure in the grave, and then returning the river to its course. The story is famous, haunting, and difficult to verify. It may preserve a genuine memory of extraordinary burial, or it may have grown into legend around a leader whose death came at a turning point. But its imagery is perfect for this wider tale treasure hidden underwater, a king buried with wealth workers killed to keep the secret, and the earth itself made to conceal what men cannot safely keep. Whether or not the temple vessels pass into Visigothic hands, the sack of Rome changes their story. From this point forward, certainty weakens and legend thickens. The treasure no longer belongs only to the known world of Roman triumph and monumental display. It enters the unstable geography of late antiquity, where peoples move, kingdoms form courts, migrate, and the old empire breaks into successor powers. The curse understood as a human pattern has crossed another threshold. Rome once claimed that taking sacred wealth proved dominion. Now Rome's own wealth can be taken, and the lesson returns with quiet severity. No city is too ancient to be entered. No treasury is too famous to be emptied. No king, however grand his monuments, owns the future simply because he owns the gold of the past. After Alaric's death, the treasure trail bends westward into a landscape where history and legend begin to walk almost side by side. The Visigoths do not remain a passing storm in Italy. They become a people in motion, carrying families, warriors, captives, memories, claims, grievances, and whatever wealth they have gathered through war and negotiation. Their movement is not the wandering of a shapeless horde, as older histories sometimes imagined it, but the difficult migration of a political community trying to secure a place inside the ruins and opportunities of the Roman world. They move through southern Gaul into the politics of imperial weakness, and eventually toward the Iberian Peninsula, where their kingdom will take root. If the temple treasure has passed into their hands, then it now travels not as a Roman trophy, but as part of a royal and military inheritance, whose meaning may have been only partly understood by its new possessors. This is where the story becomes especially dangerous for anyone who wants certainty. Later traditions place the sacred vessels in the hands of the Goths, then in Gaul, then perhaps in Spain, and sometimes in hidden royal treasuries whose exact locations seem to shift with the needs of the storyteller. These accounts are fascinating, but they do not all carry the same historical weight. Some are late, some are shaped by theology, some are written after kingdoms have already fallen and need explanations for their fall. Some may preserve fragments of real memory, while others may reflect the powerful attraction of linking famous treasure to famous ruins. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single route can be drawn on a map without stepping beyond what the sources securely allow. Yet the westward path has a logic that keeps it alive. The Visigoths did take wealth from Rome. They did establish power in regions where Roman authority had weakened. They did build royal centres where portable treasure mattered intensely. In a world where kings often ruled less from fixed capitals than from courts, armies and networks of loyalty treasure was not merely decoration. It paid followers, impressed rivals, sealed alliances, adorned churches, supported diplomacy, and gave physical weight to claims of legitimacy. A ruler who possessed objects once held by Rome could present himself not as an outsider to empire but as its heir. If those objects included the vessels of Jerusalem, the prestige would have been immense, though also uneasy. To hold Rome's spoils was to inherit Rome's victories but also Rome's thefts. The Visigothic kingdom that emerges in Gaul and later Spain is not simply anti-Roman. It is deeply entangled with Roman forms of authority. Gothic rulers use Roman administrators, Roman law, Roman cities, Roman titles, Roman Christianity in its Arian form, before later religious change and Roman ideas of kingship filtered through their own traditions. This makes the possible presence of the temple treasure even more symbolically complex. Such objects would not have been kept by people who rejected Rome entirely. They would have been kept by rulers trying to stand inside the long shadow of Rome, while also building something separate from it. Sacred plunder from Jerusalem seized by Rome, and then seized from Rome, would become a condensed history of conquest itself. One tradition places the treasure at Toulouse, the early Visigothic royal centre in southern Gaul. This is plausible in a broad political sense because Toulouse became an important seat of Gothic power in the 5th century. A royal treasury there could have held objects taken from Rome, along with gifts, tribute and wealth gathered from across the collapsing western provinces. But plausibility is not proof. Archaeology has not produced the golden menorah from beneath a palace floor in Toulouse. No secure contemporary inventory identifies the temple vessels there. What survives in the record suggests that later writers believe significant treasures moved with the Goths, but the precise contents remain uncertain. The trail then turns towards Spain, especially after the Visigoths lose much of their Gallic kingdom to the Franks in the early 6th century. Royal treasure by its nature moves when kings move. It must be protected from enemies, transported with courts, hidden in crisis, and displayed when stability returns. Spain offers another stage for the legend because the Visigothic kingdom there becomes powerful, wealthy, and eventually centered around Toledo, a city that gathers royal, religious, and political significance. If the temple treasure traveled with the Gothic kings, Spain becomes one of the strongest candidates for its later resting place. But again, the word "if" carries the whole weight of the mystery. There is a pattern in treasure legends that deserves caution. Famous lost objects tend to migrate toward famous later places. Once a kingdom becomes important, stories begin to pull older treasures into its orbit. The lost vessels of Jerusalem are too symbolically powerful to remain unattached. They're drawn into Rome, then the Goths, then Spain, then other realms of memory, because each new setting offers a dramatic reversal. The treasure seems to curse kings, because every kingdom that claims or is rumoured to claim it eventually faces crisis. But all kingdoms face crisis. The challenge is separating meaningful historical connection from the simple fact that time destroys every political order if given enough centuries. Still, the Visigothic link is not an empty fantasy. It rests on the real movement of wealth during the sack of Rome, and on later reports that connect Jewish temple objects with Western royal treasuries. Some accounts suggest that the spoils taken by the Romans from Jerusalem were later captured by the Vandals or Goths, then recovered by Byzantium. Others imply different routes. These traditions are not easy to harmonize, and scholars still debate how much they reflect actual objects, confused memories, or symbolic storytelling. The menorah, the table trumpets, curtains, and other vessels may not have all shared the same fate. One object could have been moved, another melted, another lost, another misidentified, and another remembered long after it vanished. A single treasure can become many trails. The geography of the western route is therefore less like a road and more like a fogged coastline. There are shapes in it: Rome, the Visigoths, Gaul, Spain royal treasuries later collapse. But the distances between the shapes are filled with uncertainty. The objects, if they survived, would have passed through hands that did not leave modern-style records. They may have been packed in chests guarded by royal servants, hidden during campaigns, displayed in halls pledged in diplomacy, or stored in churches for safety. They may also have disappeared quietly, their gold converted into something else, their sacred identity lost to all but a few memories. Gold survives chemically, but names do not always survive politically. What makes the westward legend so compelling is not that it can be proven cleanly, but that it captures a real transformation of the ancient world. The treasure that once stood inside a fixed sanctuary becomes portable. The empire that once displayed it from a position of overwhelming power becomes vulnerable. The peoples once pushed to the edges of Roman imagination become kings in Roman lands. Every transfer changes the treasure's meaning. In Jerusalem it belongs to worship. In Rome it becomes domination. In Gothic hands, if it was there, it becomes inheritance, bargaining power, and perhaps a dangerous proof that the new rulers have stepped into the role of the old. And so the treasure vanishes westward, not with a single dramatic disappearance, but with a gradual loss of focus. It passes from evidence into rumour, from imperial display into royal secrecy, from stone relief into scattered tradition. The farther it travels from the burning temple and the Roman triumph, the harder it becomes to say what is object, what is memory, and what is longing. But the curse continues to take shape in that uncertainty. Kings may chase the prestige of possessing the past, yet the past does not become obedient. It remains unfinished, wounded, and watchful, moving through the hands of rulers who believe they are carrying gold when they may really be carrying the ruins of every power that held it before them. In the Visigothic imagination, as far as we can reconstruct it through broken sources and later echoes, royal treasure is never merely a private hoard. It is the body of kingship made visible, A king may command warriors, issue laws, preside over councils, and sit in judgment, but treasure gives his authority weight that can be seen, touched, guarded, and feared. Gold bowls, jeweled crosses, crowns, coins, weapons, textiles, relics and objects taken from older powers, all gather around the ruler like a portable history of victory. In a kingdom still finding its shape after Rome, wealth is not only wealth. It is proof that the king stands at the center of a world that might otherwise break apart. This is why the possible presence of the temple treasure in a Visigothic royal treasury matters even if certainty remains out of reach. If the vessels from Jerusalem or even objects believed to be those vessels came into Gothic hands, they would have carried several layers of power at once. They would be sacred to the people from whom Rome had taken them imperial, because Rome had displayed them, and royal because a new king now claimed them as part of his inheritance. Such objects would make a ruler look connected to the deepest victories of the old empire, but they would also connect him to the old empire's violence, pride, and eventual humiliation. Prestige and danger would arrive together wrapped in the same gold. The Visigothic kingdom itself is never as stable as a later map can make it appear. Maps like clean borders. History rarely does. The kingdom moves through phases: power in southern Gaul, defeat by the Franks' consolidation in Spain, rivalry among nobles, tension between kings and aristocrats, religious division, and repeated struggles over succession. Kingship among the Visigoths is not a calm hereditary machine. Rulers can be chosen, challenged, overthrown, murdered, or replaced by ambitious men with enough support. The throne is powerful, but it is never entirely safe. What survives in the record suggests a political culture where royal authority must be constantly negotiated with nobles, bishops, armies, and regional powers. In that world, treasure becomes a tool of survival. A king needs it to reward loyalty. He needs it to impress those who doubt him. He needs it to sponsor churches, councils, and ceremonies. He needs it to show foreign envoys that his court is not a barbarian camp, but a legitimate successor to Roman grandeur. The royal treasury is therefore both asset and temptation. Whoever controls it controls not only metal, but the visible continuity of the kingdom. To seize the treasure is to challenge the king's claim to rule. To lose it is to appear abandoned by fortune. This may be the most realistic form of the curse. A hoard that promises legitimacy can also attract betrayal. The more famous the treasure, the more dangerous it becomes to possess. Every rival knows where authority is concentrated. Every crisis turns the treasury into a target. Sacred objects add another pressure because they are not easily reduced to payment. They cannot be spent without sacrilege or scandal if their identity is known. Yet if they are kept, they remain silent witnesses to the king's dependence on stolen memory. No single explanation fully accounts for the violence of Visigothic politics, but treasure, legitimacy, and rivalry belong in the same room. Toledo eventually becomes the great royal and ecclesiastical centre of the Visigothic kingdom in Spain. There kings gather bishops in councils, issue laws, affirm religious unity, and try to turn a warrior monarchy into a Christian kingdom with Roman intellectual and administrative inheritance. This transformation reaches a turning point when King Richard converts from Arian Christianity to Nicene Christianity in the late 6th century, reshaping the relationship between monarchy, church, and population. The change is not simply spiritual, it is political. A king who can unite religious identity can strengthen royal authority. Yet unity on parchment does not erase ambition in noble houses or suspicion in the provinces. If the treasure of Jerusalem was believed to rest somewhere within this world, perhaps in Toledo, perhaps in a royal storehouse elsewhere, its meaning would have shifted again. Under earlier Gothic rulers, it might have stood as captured imperial wealth. Under a Catholic Visigothic monarchy, It could be imagined through biblical history, sacred inheritance and divine judgment. Later storytellers may have found this irresistible. A kingdom that claims Christian legitimacy while holding the plundered vessels of the Jewish temple creates a powerful moral tension. Was the treasure a sign of favor, a relic of empire, a burden from the past, or a warning that holiness cannot be owned by kings? The evidence remains incomplete. No excavated chamber in Toledo has produced the menorah. No contemporary Visigothic royal inventory lists the temple treasure in terms that settle the matter. The famous votive crowns from the treasure of Guarazar discovered in the 19th century near Toledo show that Visigothic kings did dedicate magnificent gold objects to churches, but they do not prove the presence of Jerusalem's vessels. They do, however, reveal the world in which such a legend could breathe, a world of crowns offered before altars, gold hanging in sacred spaces, kingship expressed through shining objects, and royal power made humble before God while still advertising itself in precious metal. This is one of the lesser-known but revealing details of early medieval kingship. A crown could be made not to sit on a head but to hang above an altar as a votive gift. It proclaimed devotion, but also reminded everyone who had enough power to give such a thing. Treasure moved between palace and church, between political authority and sacred display. If older spoils lay somewhere in the royal hoard, they would have existed within this same exchange between devotion and domination. The line between piety and prestige was never as clean as later moralists might wish. Meanwhile, the Visigothic kings keep falling. Some reign briefly, some are overthrown, some are killed. Succession disputes return like a fever. Aristocratic factions form around rival claimants. The kingdom can produce law codes and councils, but it cannot fully tame the violence built into its own political structure. Scholars still debate how deeply unified the Visigothic kingdom truly became, especially across different regions of Iberia, but the repeated instability is unmistakable. Kings chase permanence with law, faith, ceremony, and treasure. Permanence refuses them. Here the legend of the cursed treasure gains emotional force even if it cannot be used as literal explanation. A sacred hoard taken from Jerusalem, displayed by Rome, seized by Goths, and hidden among kings who cannot keep their thrones, would seem to carry history's accusation inside it. But the true curse may be simpler and colder. Rulers are drawn to objects that seem to compress the authority of the past. They believe that holding such things makes them heirs to older greatness. Yet the objects also carry the failures of every power that held them before. To possess Rome's spoils is to inherit Rome's lesson. Conquest can glitter for centuries and still end in vulnerability. As the Visigothic kingdom approaches its own final crises, the treasure grows less visible and more symbolic. It may be real, hidden somewhere in royal custody. It may already be lost. It may survive only as memory attached to other treasures whose names changed in transmission. What can be said is that the idea of it fits the age perfectly. Kings stand over hoards, bishops bless crowns, nobles sharpen ambitions, and old Roman cities watch new rulers try to make themselves ancient. Beneath all of it lies the same dangerous belief that began in the smoke of Jerusalem, that sacred wealth can be taken, displayed, inherited, and made to serve power, without also carrying the shadow of what was destroyed to obtain it. While the Western Trail pulls the imagination toward Visigothic halls and hidden treasuries in Spain, another tradition sends the treasure along a different and equally unstable route south, across the Mediterranean into Africa, then eastward again into the hands of Byzantium. This path begins not with the Visigoths, but with another people who understand the weakness of Rome and the value of portable wealth, the Vandals. Their name would later become a shorthand for destruction, though that reputation is far too simple for the historical people behind it. Like the Goths, the Vandals are not shadows outside civilization. They are participants in the late Roman world shaped by migration, war diplomacy, Christianity, hunger for land, and the opportunities created when imperial authority can no longer hold every province in place. In 455 CE, Rome is sacked again. This time the conqueror is Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, who's already built a formidable kingdom in North Africa. That fact alone reveals how dramatically the old world has shifted. North Africa is not a remote edge of Roman life. It is one of the empire's great storehouses, rich in grain cities, estates, ports, bishops, merchants, and tax revenue. Carthage, once Rome's ancient enemy, and later one of its most important provincial cities, becomes the Vandal capital. From there, Gaiseric commands ships raids, coasts, negotiates with emperors, and forces the Mediterranean to remember that sea power can undo land-based confidence. Rome, which once destroyed Carthage and rebuilt it under Roman rule, now sees a kingdom based in Carthage reach back across the water to plunder Rome itself. The sack of 455 is not identical to the sack of 410. The political circumstances differ, the actors differ, and the surviving accounts carry their own biases. Some later writers emphasize that Pope Leo I persuaded Gaiseric to avoid burning the city and slaughtering its people on a massive scale, though the details and degree of restraint remain debated. What is clearer is that the Vandals carry away immense wealth. They have ships, and ships change everything. Treasure that might burden an army on land can be loaded, guarded, and transported across the sea. Rome's portable riches move toward Carthage, reversing older Roman triumphs with almost poetic cruelty. The city that once displayed the spoils of Jerusalem may now lose those spoils if they are still there to the heir of Rome's most famous African rival. This is the route supported by one of the most discussed late antique traditions about the temple treasure. Some sources suggest that the sacred vessels from Jerusalem after being taken to Rome by Titus were later carried off by the Vandals to Carthage. From there they supposedly entered the treasury of the Vandal kings. The claim is plausible enough to matter and uncertain enough to haunt. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether the reports describe the actual temple vessels, objects believed to be the vessels, or a later attempt to give moral and biblical weight to imperial plunder. But the Vandal path has a powerful historical logic. If the treasure remained in Rome until 455, and if Gaiseric's men stripped the city of imperial valuables, then Carthage becomes a credible next stop in the long chain of possession. In Vandal Africa, the treasure would have entered yet another world of kingship, religion, and instability. The Vandals, like the earlier Visigoths, are Christians of the Arian tradition, ruling over a largely Nicene Christian population in North Africa. This religious difference fuels tension, persecution, negotiation, propaganda, and later hostile memory. Ancient sources from the Catholic side often portray Vandal rule in dark colours, sometimes accurately recording suffering, sometimes sharpening the image for polemical effect. No single explanation fully accounts for the kingdom's internal dynamics, but it is clear that the Vandal monarchy has to govern a wealthy Roman province while remaining a military elite with contested legitimacy. Treasure is essential in such a world. It rewards warriors, supports diplomacy, adorns kingship, and proves that the ruler commands not only land but the accumulated wealth of old Rome. If the temple vessels rest in Carthage, their symbolism becomes almost unbearably layered. Jerusalem's sacred objects have been taken by Rome, perhaps displayed in the Temple of Peace, then seized by a kingdom ruling from the city, Rome once annihilated in the Punic Wars. The treasure passes through the ruins of imperial pride like a silent witness. The Romans had turned Carthage into a warning. Now Carthage under Vandal rule holds Rome's stolen splendor. This does not prove a curse in the supernatural sense, but it shows how history creates reversals more powerful than invention. Conquerors preserve the memory of conquest by carrying trophies, and then those trophies become available to the next conqueror. Plunder is never as secure as it looks. The Vandal kingdom lasts nearly a century in North Africa, longer than a mere episode, but less than a permanent order. It becomes rich, naval feared, and politically significant. Yet it also faces internal tensions, succession conflicts, military pressures, and the enduring hostility of the Eastern Roman Empire, which modern historians call Byzantium. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian decides to reclaim the western provinces and restore Roman authority across the Mediterranean. His general Belisarius sails to Africa in 533 CE, and in a campaign that moves with startling speed, the Vandal kingdom collapses. Carthage falls back into imperial hands. Another royal treasury is opened. Another kingdom discovers that possession is not permanence. Here the temple treasure appears again in tradition. Belisarius is said to have recovered the spoils that the Vandals had taken from Rome, including, according to some accounts, the treasures once seized from Jerusalem. These objects are then brought to Constantinople, the eastern imperial capital, where Justinian can present himself as restorer of Roman greatness and avenger of old humiliations. The pattern repeats with almost ritual precision. A ruler takes the treasure from those who took it before him, and each transfer becomes proof of divine favor, military genius, or historical destiny. Yet each proof is temporary. One later story adds a remarkable twist. The sacred vessels after reaching Constantinople are supposedly considered dangerous to keep because they had brought misfortune to every city that held them. An advisor warns that they should not remain in the imperial capital, and Justinian sends them to Jerusalem or to a Christian holy place there. This account is difficult to verify, and scholars treat it cautiously. It may reflect theological storytelling rather than an exact record of policy. But as a piece of historical memory, it is revealing. By the 6th century, the treasure is imagined not merely as valuable, but as hazardous. The idea of the curse has become explicit. The objects are no longer passive trophies. They are things whose history is too heavy for kings to hold comfortably. Whether they truly returned to Jerusalem is unknown. If they did not reappear in a way that settles the matter. If they reached Constantinople, they later vanished from secure record. If the whole tradition confuses real temple vessels with other Jewish or Roman spoils, the mystery remains. But the Africa-Byzantium trail deepens the central pattern. Jerusalem-Rome, Carthage-Constantinople. Each city represents a different claim to sacred or imperial authority, and each one proves vulnerable. The treasure moves through them like a bright thread stitched into a torn map. Wherever it goes, rulers imagine they have recovered more than gold. They imagine they have recovered history itself, and history, as it always does, refuses to stay recovered. By the time the treasure reaches the edge of recoverable history, the most important evidence is no longer gold but silence. Silence in archives, silence in excavated rooms, silence in damaged chronicles where a single missing sentence might have changed everything. The story has moved from Jerusalem's burning courts to Rome's triumphal streets, from the carved certainty of the Arch of Titus into the uncertain roots of Goths, Vandals, Carthage, Constantinople, and perhaps Jerusalem again. Each stage has enough substance to be taken seriously, but not enough to close the case. The treasure survives most clearly where history is strongest at recording spectacle. It vanishes where history becomes bad at recording storage transfer and loss. This is the first difficulty. Ancient sources are often excellent at describing events that serve moral, political, or dramatic purposes, but they are much less reliable when modern readers want administrative precision. A triumph is worth recording. A sack of Rome is worth recording. The fall of a kingdom is worth recording. But the quiet movement of sacred vessels from one treasury to another may leave no surviving trace at all. A chest can be carried by servants at night. A damaged object can be melted without ceremony. A relic can be hidden during war and forgotten by the third generation. A name can be copied incorrectly by a scribe who has never seen the thing being described. The evidence remains incomplete not because the treasure was unimportant, but because importance does not guarantee preservation. The Arch of Titus gives the most solid visual anchor. There the menorah and other objects appear in stone, confirming that Rome displayed at least some of the temple spoils after the Jewish war. But the arch also creates a kind of trap. Because the image is so vivid, it tempts the mind to imagine an equally vivid chain. Afterward, the menorah in a Roman hall, the menorah seized by invaders, the menorah carried into a royal treasury, the menorah hidden in a mountain, a river, a church, a vault. Yet after the arch, the record becomes fragmentary. We have references, traditions, and later claims, but not the kind of continuous documentation that would allow a historian to follow the object from hand to hand with confidence. Texts create the next problem. Josephus gives invaluable detail about the war and the triumph, but his position under Roman patronage requires caution. Later Roman Christian, Byzantine, and medieval writers inherit stories shaped by their own concerns. Some want to prove divine judgment. Some want to glorify emperors. Some want to explain why kingdoms rise and fall. Some are repeating older sources they may not fully understand. When a writer centuries later says that the treasures of the Jews were taken from one city to another, the statement may preserve real information, but it may also compress several traditions into one meaningful pattern. Scholars still debate where memory ends and literary design begins. Even the word treasure can mislead. Modern imagination often treats the temple treasure as a single unified hoard, like a sealed chest passing intact through time. In reality, the objects may have had different fates. The menorah table, trumpets, curtains, bowls, and other sacred vessels could have been separated almost immediately. Some may have been displayed publicly, some may have been stored, some may have been damaged by fire, some may have been melted for bullion during later financial crises. Some may have been mistaken for other ritual objects in later inventories. No single explanation fully accounts for all the traditions because the traditions may not all be describing the same things. Archaeology, which feels as if it should rescue the story from uncertainty, has its own limits. Excavation can reveal walls, floors, burn layers, coins, inscriptions, storage rooms, and sometimes astonishingly delicate objects. But gold is exactly the kind of material least likely to remain where history left it. People recover it, reuse it, hide it, steal it, melt it, and reshape it. A bronze lamp, a ceramic jar, or a broken inscription may survive by being overlooked. Gold rarely enjoys the protection of neglect. If the sacred vessels were ever melted into coins, ornaments, church plate, or royal gifts, their physical atoms might still exist somewhere, but their historical identity would be gone. Archaeology cannot easily recognize a lost sacred vessel after it has become anonymous metal. There is also the problem of place. Rome has been inhabited, rebuilt, damaged, flooded, quarried, Christianized, medievalized, excavated and restored for nearly 2,000 years since the triumph. Carthage has been destroyed, rebuilt, excavated and reinterpreted through layers of Punic, Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, and later history. Constantinople, now Istanbul, has endured sieges, fires, iconoclasm, conquest, reconstruction, and the constant reuse of imperial spaces. Toledo, Toulouse, and other possible Western sites have their own layers of occupation and disturbance. To search for the treasure in any one of these places is not like opening an untouched tomb. It is like listening for one whispered name inside a storm of centuries. Popular theories often rush into this silence. Some place the menorah beneath the Vatican, imagining a secret continuity from imperial Rome to the papal city. Others send it into the tunnels of Jerusalem, the treasuries of medieval kings, the lost hoards of the Visigoths, or hidden chambers beneath old churches. These ideas endure because they give the mystery a location and a promise. Somewhere they suggest the treasure is still waiting. Some versions are possible in the broadest sense. Many are unsupported. A few belong more to modern legend than to evidence. Responsible history cannot treat absence as proof. A treasure not found beneath one building does not prove it lies beneath another. A story repeated often does not become stronger unless its sources become stronger too. Yet skepticism does not empty the mystery of meaning. In fact, the uncertainty reveals why the treasure remains so powerful. If it had been securely found, catalogued, and placed behind museum glass, it would still be extraordinary, but its symbolic life would change. The missing treasure belongs partly to history and partly to longing. It represents the objects themselves, but also the impossibility of repairing the rupture that began with the temple's destruction. What was taken cannot simply be returned by discovery alone because the world that made those objects usable is gone. The vessels can be imagined, carved, described, debated, and searched for, but the sacred order they served cannot be reconstructed from gold. This is what the evidence cannot prove, and what the silence cannot erase. It cannot prove the exact route through every kingdom. It cannot prove the curse as a force. It cannot prove that the menorah still survives intact and hidden, waiting for light to strike its branches again. But it does prove something about conquest. Sacred plunder becomes unstable the moment it leaves its home. Records break around it. Rulers claim it, lose it, fear it, reinterpret it. Later generations use it to explain collapse, because collapse follows every empire eventually. The treasure vanishes not only because objects disappear, but because power itself is temporary. What remains is a carved image, scattered testimony, and a mystery shaped by the failures of every kingdom that tried to turn holiness into possession. The curse, if it exists at all, does not need to hide inside the metal. It does not need to wait beneath a riverbed glow in a sealed chamber, or move invisibly from king to king like a living thing. The more unsettling possibility is that the curse is human, ordinary, and repeatable. It begins whenever rulers convince themselves that the sacred objects of another people can be converted into proof of their own permanence. A king takes a vessel, a crown, a statue, a relic, a holy book, a temple treasury, and believes he has taken more than wealth. He believes he has taken the authority attached to it. He believes possession can become legitimacy. History keeps answering him with ruins. This pattern is older than Rome and broader than Jerusalem. Ancient Near Eastern kings carried off divine images from defeated cities, not merely to enrich themselves, but to show that the gods of the conquered had abandoned their people or been brought under new control. Mesopotamian inscriptions often speak the language of divine favor and cosmic order, though the exact meaning of each act of plunder depended on local belief, politics, and ritual. Egyptian pharaohs, Assyrian conquerors, Babylonian kings, Persian rulers, Hellenistic dynasts, Roman generals, medieval monarchs, and modern armies have all understood that symbolic objects can matter as much as fortresses. To seize a sacred object is to wound a community at the point where memory and identity meet. But sacred plunder is never stable. That is the hidden flaw. A coin can pass easily from hand to hand because its value is designed to move. A sacred vessel is different. It has a home, a story, a ritual, place a pattern of handling and a circle of meaning that cannot be packed into a chest. When it is carried away, it becomes both less and more than it was. Less because it no longer functions within the world that made it sacred, more because its displacement turns it into a symbol of violence. The conqueror owns the object, but the conquered still own the wound. The object sits in the victor's treasury as a reminder that power has reached its hand into forbidden space. Rome's treatment of the Jerusalem treasure fits this pattern with almost painful clarity. The empire takes the vessels from a destroyed sanctuary and displays them as evidence of victory. In the short term, the message works. The crowd sees gold. The dynasty gains prestige. The arch preserves triumph. The spoils help shape imperial memory. But in the long term, the meaning escapes. The carved menorah on the Arch of Titus becomes not only a Roman boast, but a Jewish memory of loss, a Christian problem of interpretation, an archaeological clue and a historical accusation. The object that was supposed to prove Rome's dominance ends by proving that Rome too could not control the future. No single explanation fully accounts for why certain treasures gather legends of disaster, while others disappear without moral weight. Part of it is chance, part of it is storytelling, part of it is the human need to make suffering legible. When a king falls after taking sacred wealth, people remember the treasure. When a kingdom collapses after inheriting stolen objects, people see a pattern. Sometimes the pattern is exaggerated after the fact. Sometimes it is shaped by enemies who want to portray the fallen ruler as impious. Yet beneath the exaggeration lies a real historical truth. Sacred plunder often enters political systems already under strain. It is taken in war, held by ambitious rulers moved during crisis and lost when power shifts again. It does not cause instability by magic. It travels because instability exists. This is why the treasure seems to follow collapsing worlds. It leaves Jerusalem during revolt and siege. It enters Rome during dynastic insecurity after civil war. It may pass to Goths or Vandals in the age of imperial fragmentation. It may reach Carthage, Constantinople, or other centers where rulers are trying to claim inheritance from Rome while fighting for survival. Each possessor stands in a moment of transition. Each wants the treasure to say the past now belongs to me. But the past does not belong to anyone so easily. It resists being used as decoration for a new regime. There is also a psychological curse in such possession. A ruler who holds sacred plunder may become trapped by the story he wants it to tell. If he hides it, he cannot use its prestige. If he displays it, he keeps alive the memory of theft. If he melts it, he may gain metal but lose symbolic power, and perhaps invite accusations of sacrilege. If he returns it, he admits that possession was illegitimate. Every option is uneasy. This is the burden of objects too meaningful to become ordinary wealth. They do not simply enrich a treasury, they complicate it. The same pattern appears in quieter forms across history. Conquered statues placed in foreign capitals become evidence of empire, then later evidence of removal. Royal regalia stolen in war become diplomatic problems centuries later. Sacred manuscripts taken by armies become museum treasures and moral disputes. Human remains, ceremonial objects, and temple art collected under colonial power continue to trouble institutions long after the empires that took them have changed their names or vanished. The details differ, and the temple treasure belongs to its own ancient world, but the underlying problem remains recognizable. Taking an object is easier than settling what the object means. The evidence remains incomplete for the exact fate of the Jerusalem vessels, but the pattern around them is complete enough to understand. Every power that touches the story wants to turn it toward itself. Rome wants victory. The Goths, if they held it, would have wanted inheritance. The Vandals, if they carried it, would have wanted proof that Rome could be humbled. Byzantium, if it recovered, it would have wanted restoration. Later legends want hidden justice, buried revelation, or divine warning. Each age reshapes the treasure according to its fear and hope. The gold becomes a mirror in which rulers and communities see what they most need to believe. That is the real curse of kings, not that treasure destroys them, but that they imagine treasure can save them from the fate of all power. They place old holiness under guard and think the past has been mastered. They build arches, treasuries, palaces, churches, and royal halls around objects that came from someone else's broken world. But the objects keep their older silence. They do not bless the new owner simply because he has soldiers. They do not forget the fire. They do not forget the hands that made them, the rites that shaped them, or the city that lost them. And when the king dies, when the dynasty fails, when the capital is breached, the treasure waits for the next ruler to misunderstand it in exactly the same way. The treasure survives most clearly by not being found. That seems like a paradox, but it is often how the deepest historical objects continue to live. Once an object is recovered, measured, placed in a case, photographed, catalogued, and assigned a temperature-controlled room, it gains clarity, but loses some of its haunting reach. The temple vessels remain different. They are anchored to a real event visible on Roman stone, remembered in texts drawn into the fall of cities, and the anxieties of kings yet absent from the world of certain things. Their disappearance has allowed them to outlive every ruler who tried to give them a final meaning. Rome displayed them. Later powers may have carried them, feared them, hidden them, or claimed them, but none of those powers succeeded in making the treasure belong only to itself. This is why the image on the Arch of Titus has become almost more powerful than the missing gold. The carved menorah is not the object, but it has become the surviving witness of the object's capture. Its stone branches carry a memory that bullion could not guarantee. Gold can be erased by greed. Stone can be reinterpreted by grief. For the Roman viewer, the relief once declared conquest. For later Jewish memory, it preserved catastrophe. For archaeologists and historians, it became evidence. For artists, it became an image of endurance. For modern visitors, it remains one of the rare places where ancient violence is not abstract. The scene is still there, men carrying sacred objects away from a destroyed world, unaware that the empire celebrating them will also fade. The treasure also survives in longing. Longing is not the same as evidence, and responsible history must keep that distinction clear, but longing is one of the forces that preserves memory when archives fail. The missing vessels represent a wound that cannot be fully closed because their loss is tied to the loss of a sanctuary, a city, and a ritual order. Even if the objects were found tomorrow shining under dust in some impossible chamber, they would not restore the world from which they came. That is part of their power. They stand for what cannot simply be returned: uninterrupted continuity, sacred time, and a home not yet broken by fire. Over centuries, every empire and kingdom connected to the treasure loses its claimed permanence. The Flavian dynasty vanishes quickly. Western Rome fractures. The Visigothic kingdom falls. Vandal Carthage collapses before Byzantine arms. Byzantine power itself endures for centuries, then shrinks, struggles, and finally falls to another conqueror. Cities change, names, languages, rulers, and religions. Sacred buildings become ruins, churches, mosques, museums, or stones reused in walls. The treasure, whether physically destroyed or hidden beyond reach, becomes a measure of time's irony. It was taken by rulers who believed victory could be made permanent through possession. Yet what remains permanent is not their ownership. It is the memory of the taking. Scholars still debate the final route of the vessels because the evidence remains incomplete, and perhaps it always will. Some trails point toward Rome, some toward Carthage, some toward Constantinople, some toward Western royal treasuries, and some dissolve into legend. No single explanation fully accounts for every surviving tradition, but the search itself reveals how deeply the treasure has entered historical imagination. People do not search only for gold. They search for confirmation that the past still has a hidden chamber, that loss has a location, that something carried away in fire has not been entirely consumed by time. The lesser-known truth is that disappearance can become a kind of preservation. The missing object is protected from becoming ordinary. It cannot be reduced to a museum label, a diplomatic dispute, or a triumph of discovery. It remains suspended between evidence and absence, and in that space it gathers meanings no single owner can control. This does not mean historians should romanticize uncertainty. The discipline of history depends on caution evidence and the willingness to say when something cannot be known. But the human imagination also depends on the spaces where certainty ends. The temple treasure stands exactly there at the border, between what was carved in stone and what vanished into silence. By outliving kings, the treasure also outlives the stories kings told about themselves. Vespasian and Titus used it to declare victory. Later rulers, if they possessed it, may have used it to claim inheritance. Legends used it to explain misfortune. Modern debates use it to test evidence against desire. Through all of this, the objects remain connected to the first meaning that made them powerful. They were not made for conquest. They were made for service inside a sacred order. Everything after that is displacement. Every triumph, every sack, every hidden treasury, every rumor of return is part of the long afterlife of something removed from its proper place. And so the treasure that became a curse for kings is not cursed because it kills them one by one in a neat sequence. It is cursed because it exposes the lie kings often need most, that power can take the sacred, rename it, and keep it forever. The vessels pass through history like a silent judgment on that belief. They show that the most valuable things in a civilization are not always the things that can be carried away. Sometimes the true treasure is the web of meaning around the object, the prayers, the processions, the laws, the memories, the hands that guarded it, the city that rose around it, and the generations that still feel its absence. Rome could carry the gold. It could not carry the world that made the gold holy. What remains then is not a solved mystery but a surviving one, a lampstand in stone, a burned sanctuary in memory, a chain of conquerors who all became temporary, a treasure whose final hiding place may be less important than the lesson left by its disappearance. Kings took it to prove that they had mastered history. Instead, history mastered them. The treasure is gone or hidden or transformed beyond recognition. Yet its story still shines with a strange, severe light, not from polished gold, but from the long memory of everything power failed to keep. The story slows here because the treasure has moved beyond the reach of pursuit. It no longer stands clearly inside a sanctuary, a Roman hall, a Gothic treasury, a Vandal ship, or a Byzantine palace. It has entered that quieter country, where history becomes memory, and memory becomes landscape. The stones of Jerusalem still hold evening light. The old roads to Rome still run beneath modern feet. The sea between Italy and Africa still folds over the routes of ships that carried grain, armies, captives, and perhaps sacred gold. Cities that once trembled at the names of emperors now sleep under other names, other languages, other prayers. There is comfort in a strange way in the failure of kings to keep what they seized. Their monuments were loud, but time is patient. Their triumphs filled streets, but streets empty. Their treasuries were locked, but locks rust. Palaces burn, records scatter, and even gold can lose its name. What remains is not the certainty they wanted. It is a gentler and more difficult truth. Civilizations are held together by meanings no army can fully capture. A vessel may be taken. A lampstand may be lifted on poles and carried through a cheering capital. A sacred table may be placed among trophies beneath the roof of a conqueror. But the meaning of those objects travels differently. It waits in grief, in ritual, in art, in refusal, in scholarship, in whispered tradition, and in the stubborn human need to remember what was lost. Perhaps the treasure lies nowhere now. Perhaps it was melted long ago, its gold scattered into coins, cups, ornaments, or dust. Perhaps some fragment survived without a name, resting in a place no one recognizes. Perhaps the only surviving treasure is the image carved in stone and the longing it continues to awaken. The evidence does not let us go further with certainty, but uncertainty does not make the story empty. It makes it human. As night settles over the old cities of the Mediterranean, the empires fade into layers. Jerusalem, Rome, Carthage, Constantinople, Toledo. Each carries its own ghosts, its own silences, its own buried foundations. Somewhere among them, not necessarily in the ground, but in memory, the treasure remains. Not as a prize for kings, not as a trophy of conquest, but as a final quiet reminder that the things taken by force are never truly possessed. They continue to belong to time, to loss, and to the people who remember.